Hello, I'm Robert, a fact checker and science blogger, and helping people who are scared of many things. Welcome to my channel. So this is about people who are scared about water wars. So this is something that if you go and look on the internet and you're scared of something, you'll find a blog post or a news story from sensationalist press reinforcing almost anything you're scared of and saying it's going to happen. And this is not something that can happen. So they take the analogy of oil and they say in the future water is going to be as scarce as oil and we're going to have wars about water just like we have wars about oil. And that just doesn't work out. So what we do have, the reason being it's just not worth the cost of shipping water from say Canada to the Middle East or something like that, like you would do if it was oil. It's just not valuable enough for that. So you can have border conflicts when countries are sharing all sharing as one river, like for instance the Nile, or the water from the Himalayas and in India, and so you do get these. You sometimes get border conflicts about these things, and that there are some in the. I have some examples down here. So let's see. Let's go and look at the conflicts thing. Let's use some actual example. Now where is it? Right, here we are. Water conflict. There have been the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, and Jordan rivers. They all run through many countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So those are good examples. And so there's lots of potential for conflict. For instance, in Ethiopia, as there's certainly political differences between Ethiopia, which is very high up the Nile, and way down in Egypt. And what do we do with the water? Let me just pause a minute. I'll bring this up. Right, so this is a big dam in it says just wait a minute there. A big dam in Ethiopia, and this dams the Nile, and so you get conflict between Ethiopia. You have political issues between Ethiopia and Egypt, even though they're quite a distance away, because it affects the flow of the Nile. So this is an example, and Egypt and Sudan, the two countries downstream, because it's so depending on how much water, the water can be held back by the dam, and then Ethiopia can let it out and it can hold it back at different times. So that affects the Sudan and Egypt. So these are the sort of situations where you can get strong political differences, and sometimes you do get conflict, but cooperation is far more common than conflict over water. So this is a UN study of it. There are many reasons to be optimistic. Since 1948 there have been 37 incidents of acute conflict over water, while approximately 295 international water agreements were negotiated and signed in the same period. So there are far more water agreements than there are incidents of acute conflict. So you do get conflict over water, but this is very rare. It's much more common to come to an international agreement. And this is the situation for the future. There's no way we're going to have massive wars like the Gulf War kind of thing. We're not going to have things like that about water. And there are many things that countries can do about it. So it's a case of using the water more carefully, as we already do in desert areas. So as the world gets warmer, it's not uniformly going to get drier. Actually, you get more water in the atmosphere in a warmer world because the ocean evaporates more. So you actually get many areas get wetter as it gets warmer, other areas get drier. And for instance, in India and in Bangladesh, then there's much more water coming down because the ice in the Himalayas is melting. And so this is increasing the amount of water that comes down, and you get more water in the wet season and drier in the dry season. And so it's a case of trying to equalise between the two. And that will happen until the middle of the century, when eventually quite a lot of the ice from the glaciers has melted. And then it'll start drying up. And then they have to manage the transition to that, when we have a more normal and even a drier wet season, and then it's still dry in the dry season. So you have to look locally. Each particular area of the world has different problems. And sometimes, for instance, I'm in the UK, and we're not likely to have much of a drought except in summer. In the winter, our problem is flooding, because we have a warmer, wetter winters, and then we have drier summers. And the flooding is often in the news now in the United Kingdom in winter, because it's basically getting wetter than it was in the past. And that's probably, that's a prediction of global warming. So in different parts of the world you have different issues, and sometimes it's too much water. And that's the situation in the United Kingdom in winter. And yet in summer it gets too dry. So we have a similar problem indeed to India for completely different reasons, of finding ways to equalise the water and retain water from the winter through to the summer, because we have some very dry periods in the summer now due to global warming, a little bit more than we normally had. But you look at the United Kingdom, it's always grass growing everywhere. So when we talk and we grumble and we say, oh, we have these very dry summers, oh, we've got such dry summers now, what on earth are farmers going to do with these very dry summers? And someone from Saudi Arabia or something would look around and say, there's grass growing everywhere, what are you talking about? How can the summer be too dry when you've got green grass growing absolutely everywhere? And, it's a case of adjusting to the change of climate. And there are plenty of ways of working with these droughts that we're having relative to what was normal for your climate. And there's no problem at all. The United Kingdom, actually, I'm in the United Kingdom, and if we were to be very efficient with our agriculture, we could grow enough agriculture for everyone in the United Kingdom, enough food, and meat included, and milk. So the reason we can't do that is because we are specialised in dairy cows, and we feed them grain, and we export vast amounts of milk to Europe. And we export so much milk to Europe, we use up so much land with our dairy cows for exports, that we can't be self-sufficient. But we could if we were to go back to just making enough milk for ourselves. And various other things, if we were to tweak various other things, then the United Kingdom could be self-sufficient in food without having to change our diet. So the way the world is, we need to look at the way the world is working, and we don't need to make these huge changes. The United Kingdom doesn't have to be self-sufficient in food. And instead, we need to look at what we're doing and work out a better way to do it for the entire world, in looking at the way that we, for instance, feed our cows. And so it's like that with water as well. So for instance, in India, they are now using drip-fed agriculture, which greatly improves the amount of water supply. And they also have very fast-growing rice, which can produce a crop at the end of the growing season, leaving enough time before the end of the rainy season. They can actually harvest the rice before the end of the rainy season, giving them enough time to plant a new crop after the rice, which they never could do before. And this is because the rice is so much faster growing with the new varieties. So then they have other crops that they plant after that, lentils or something like that, and they will plant that at the end of the wet season, and then use drip-fed agriculture, and they can keep it going all the way through the dry season. So they now have two crops instead of one. So large areas of India have actually doubled their agricultural output, even while it's getting drier in the dry season. So it's really a matter of just being very careful and cautious in how you do it. And then in India, so I've got another link about that. I'm just talking about it. I'll give the link in the video description. It's at the end of this page. I'll just talk about it very briefly. So there are lots of ways that you can slow down the water that is coming off the Himalayas. So the big problem in India is you get massive amounts of water at some times of the year, and then it's dry for the rest of the year. So what you have to do is to trap this water, And when you hear that parts of India, they have big problems with drought, you go and look, and some of them, because they've had a period of time where they haven't had any problems, then they've actually done things like building over reservoirs and building houses where there used to be reservoirs. So they've lost some of this resilience, because they used to have lots of resilience, and then they started building over the reservoir, saying we've got plenty of water, and then the water started drying out again with climate change, and so then they have to build these reservoirs again, and they have to trap water from people's roofs, and get individual houses to try and trap water as well, and then they do things like there's certain things you can do to slow down rivers. You put a little hump on the for instance on the not a dam, but it's just a little hump below the surface of the river to slow it down, and that leads to more water spreading out into the fields to either side of the river. And so you can do things like that as well. So they're doing ways, if you can slow down the water in the rainy season, more water gets into the fields and fills the water table, and then you've got more water for the dry season. So there are all sorts of things they're doing to use the water more efficiently. And this, we're not going to have wars over this. We're going to have people working to use the water more efficiently, as well as this, things looking very optimistic with reducing the CO2 emissions. But we now know, they used to say a couple of decades ago that we shouldn't build in resilience because we want to give people motivation to reduce CO2 emissions. But now people stop thinking like that, and we've got to do both. We've got to build in resilience and reduce CO2 emissions. And countries around the world are building in lots of resilience to deal with the problem of drier conditions in some parts of the world with the water. So there's no way we're going to have water wars. And then if you look, for instance, at the United States, this is a very good example where Canada has masses of water, and the United States has deserts not very far away, but Canada is very concerned about what would happen if they were to permit export of water to the United States, because anyone could because then you get people competing in Canada to export water to the United States at the lowest possible cost, and that could lead to them taking so much water that they harm their own lakes and ecosystems, because Canada's ecosystem is used to masses of water. So there's plenty of water, and then if they can work out an equitable way of doing it, it's not going to cause these problems. So you have this political problem between Canada and the United States, that Canada's plenty of water and it could certainly export some to the United States, but it has to be careful that it doesn't do it in such a way as to lead to Canada exporting too much water from particular ecosystems where it's easy to export it. And the US does import from Canada as bottled water, but not in big quantities in pipelines. It can import water from Alaska because that's part of the United States, but that would involve tankers. So the United States isn't going to go to war with anyone else. If it really did want to import water, it would get it from Alaska. It's not going to go to war for Canada over water. But the US has many solutions. Apart from anything else, the United States is a wealthy country, and Israel already gets a lot of its municipal water from desalination. And it's got to the point where desalination is cost very, very little, and parts of India are using desalination for their cities, and also some of the Middle East, other states in the Middle East. I think UAE uses desalination as well. So desalination has got far less expensive than it was, and it's got to the point where it can compete with water from rivers in places where water is scarce. And you actually get salt and other byproducts from the desalination as well to help with it. And you can actually make very efficient desalination plants that extract very useful, even metals as well from the sea as a part of the process of desalination. So it's the cost of water, the price of water by desalination is $1 per cubic meter, and for 4 cents per gallon. And by comparison, crude oil costs about $1 per gallon. So it just costs as long as you've got sea nearby, then it's the cost of desalinating the water per gallon is only 4 cents. So your the value of your water for export can't rise above 4 cents per gallon, because then you'd be selling them to the country at more than the cost of desalinating it and getting it through desalination. So there's a big difference between, you can go to wars over something that costs $1 per gallon, but it's very hard to see anyone going for a war for something that's only worth 4 cents per gallon. And so we do already have exports of water, and this is an example. This is a water bag that Nordic Water Supply uses, and that is used to tow water between Turkey and northern Cyprus. So especially over small distances, and if the place you're exporting to has a great shortage of water, then it can be worth doing water exports. But it's not at the level where it's, and that could actually cost, presumably it costs less than a desalination plant because it's such a short distance. But it's just not going to be something that is going to be worth exporting from, say, Canada to the Middle East, and then you have water wars over Canada's water supplies. It's just not ever going to happen. You get so many mistaken blog posts and YouTube videos and things saying we're going to have a wars over water, and it's just impossible to see how we could ever have a war over water in like a Gulf War. It just doesn't make sense. New Zealand is another country that could export water, and that also it's very and that's New Zealand could do it very. It's a rather low cost water export from New Zealand because companies pay only a notional amount to the government. So basically, they've got something that's free, and it's just the cost of transport. And so in that situation, it could be worth exporting it, and it's very controversial for water exports from New Zealand. And there's another way. There's one possibility of a water export that is using icebergs, and this is one entrepreneur in the UAE, and he wants to tug an iceberg from Antarctica where there's lots of ice. And they said they tried their first trial iceberg in 2019. That didn't happen. It's going to happen. I think it's going to happen, and it'll be in the news when eventually they do it. And their first one, they're going to tug from Antarctica to South Africa, which is quite a short distance, and where they could value having water. So you might be a bit surprised, but ice has got very high thermal capacity and it melts very, very slowly. So it's only going to be a very, very slow process of melting. And so they figure out that they can tug it all the way. So that is a little bit out of date now. It's now sometime, it'll be 2021 now surely, but they are going to do it because it hasn't been in the news yet. So and this is going to be part of the larger greening of the empty quarter in South. Is it the UAE and the empty quarter? So they're big projects of greening the deserts, and this entrepreneur is looking at using icebergs from Antarctica to green the deserts in the UAE. And so this presumably is able to compete with desalination because it's a very low-cost way of moving ice around. So you could go and get the ice from Antarctica and tug an iceberg from Antarctica all the way to the UAE. It takes ages and ages and ages for the ice to melt. And this is a video about their project. And so they would be there, and then they cover it with something, and they even with the heat from the Middle East sun, it would still last long enough so they can easily then go through the process of melting it and taking, of extracting the water and taking it and piping it ashore. And so this is something that could happen. But again, we're not going to have wars over the ice in Antarctica. Anyone who wants to go there can go and drag an iceberg up to the UAE, and it's hardly a limited resource. The amount of ice in Antarctica, there's vast amounts of ice in Antarctica, and it's very easy to he thinks it's going to be quite easy to transport. They're basically going to put something around the iceberg and tug the iceberg all the way up to the UAE. He's going to start with a small iceberg and tug it to South Africa. And so sometime in the next year or two, we expect to see in the news that a news story of an iceberg being tugged into South Africa from Antarctica by this entrepreneur. He's still going ahead with it. It gets delayed a bit, as happens with these big projects, but he's still keen on doing it. So that seems quite a likely thing to happen. And so ask, why is the United States going short of water? And it's mainly, details differ, but there's a whole series of states. And I've actually got the Colorado River. I've got a separate. I could bring this up, but I think that could be a separate video. But there's several states, about 6 states, that all use the same water resource that is based on the snow from the Rockies, I think. And I'll quickly bring it up. Let me see. How are we doing? 20 minutes. Will the Colorado run dry? So I think I'll do that as a separate video at some point. I've got to add another link to that, to this article, because I realise I've left it out. But there's I'll just quickly bring it up. Wait a minute, I'll pause this. Yes, here goes. So the states are Colorado, New Mexico, Utah and Wyoming, and then Arizona, California and Nevada, and they all share the same water supply. And this particular one, Lake Powell. So the problem, they're not running out of water. They are, but they have, and there's this idea of water futures, which are helping farmers cope with the fluctuating prices of irrigation of water, but they're not running out of water. But sometimes the water gets more expensive and sometimes it gets less expensive. And so it's difficult for farmers to cope with that. So they have these water futures where that helps them. They have these investors who then take on the risk instead of the farmer. And then some years these investors make a profit out of this. And so that helps make it much easier for the farmers to live year to year. But there's plenty of water. There's plenty of water at the moment. But what they have to do is a case of using the water more carefully, as they do in desert areas, and retaining it, and actively replenishing the aquifers. For instance, slowing down rivers and desalination and all these things I talked about before. So there are many ways that they can deal with this, but for the moment they have plenty of. And so I've done a link that way, but I haven't done a link the other way. So, and that's about the water futures. So I'll put a link to that in my Water Wars article. So the US is the problems with the distribution of water, basically, in the United States, and with many states competing for the same water resource. It's very similar to the Middle East and all the states competing for the water from the Nile, for all the countries. In the United States, it's states. In North Africa and in the Middle East, it's countries that are about the same size as the US states. And so it's the same thing as everywhere, that you come to water agreements and you find ways of using the water equitably. And so, and basically it's being solved by water agreements, and then the individual states learning to use their water more efficiently. And so ones that are used to having lots and lots of water, and they say, we've got plenty of water, we've got a good agreement, and we don't need to worry about our water. Learning to be a bit more careful with their water, and that will deal with most of it. And then you do have the possibility of desalination, but for instance, with California, then they're all right for quite a few years into the future with the agreements they've got so far and with the projections they've got, and then they just have to work out and continually work with being more efficient in their agriculture, and particular things, there's certain things, I think it's almonds or something, that need lots of water, and so the farmers that grow these particular crops, then they have to be careful about the irrigation and find better ways of doing it. And then again, it's the usual thing when you've got lots of water, to find ways of storing that in aquifers, and instead of just letting it go to the sea. And then, so they're on it, they're on the job, they know what to do. So and that's the same situation all the way around the world. We're not going to have wars about it, but there are going to be lots of complex things that we have to work out people come, just like in the United Kingdom where we've got vast amounts of water. If you were in almost anywhere in the world, you'd think we've got so much water. How can they possibly think that they're getting short of water? But in the summer, with the crops that we grow that are used to being very wet all the year round, then for us it's a problem. And in the entire world it's like that. So we all have these problems that other people have solved somewhere else. So we look at their solutions and apply them to the United Kingdom. So we have got, if you were in Saudi Arabia, you'd think, what are they fussing about? They've got so much water. How can they possibly run short of water in summer? It just doesn't make sense that they could be short of water. They just have to use it a bit more efficiently. But for us, it is a major problem that we have to think, we've got to get a new mindset, a new way of working, where farmers have to be a bit more careful with their water in summer, and they may even have to do more careful irrigation in summer than they ever had to do. They just used to have these fields, and then the water just falls out of the sky onto the field, and they have to do hardly anything by way of, they don't have to irrigate. With most fields in the United Kingdom, your problem isn't irrigating it, your problem is draining it. And we've got to turn around this mindset and say, well, in the summer, sometimes we have to, instead of drain it, we have to irrigate it. And it's quite a difficult mindset change to do if you're in the United Kingdom and your problem has been draining the land. And now we've got to think, well, we've got to irrigate it. For agriculture, we've always had, using hose pipes for gardens in a very dry period in the summer. We now need to look into irrigating our fields in the summer. So farmers have to look into installing irrigation where they've never had to do so before. They just drive about in the tractor, they just expect the rain to fall out of the sky, and that's it. And there are not many fields in the United Kingdom even now where there's a system of irrigation to deal with dry periods in the summer. So that's part of it. And then you've got to retain the water, because you need, if you're going to irrigate your fields, obviously you've got to have some water to irrigate it with when there's less water. So you need to make sure you may need to have more water reservoirs than we had in the past. So we are going to solve it. There's no problem. We're going to solve it in the United Kingdom, and it's the same everywhere in the world. So anyway, so that's it. So if you get someone saying that we're going to have water wars just like we have oil wars, and they just use analogy, and these people haven't looked into the details at all. They just say, look, when we have shortages of oil, we get oil wars. We're going to have shortages of water, therefore we're going to have water wars. And they just have some facile argument like that. And they just haven't thought it through. They haven't researched. They haven't looked it up. They haven't looked at what's actually happening in the real world. And in the real world, we are not going to have water wars. We could have these conflicts just like we already have, and in the future we will continue to have conflicts, but we will continue to have water agreements, and the water agreements by far exceed the water conflicts. It's far more common to come to a good water agreement, and it's only between neighbouring countries. We're never going to have countries going and saying, I'm going to invade, or I'm going to attack Canada because they've got so much water. That's not going to happen in any future. But we may get people exporting water from Antarctica in icebergs if that really takes off. And we already do have exports over short distances, or from countries where the water is very, very low cost. Then it can be so low cost that if it's basically the water is free, if the government doesn't put any cost on the water, like New Zealand, then it can be worth exporting it, but it has to basically almost free for that to be worth doing at the 4 cents per gallon competition from desalination, never mind improving irrigation, which would be much lower cost than that. So anyway, I'll upload this, and hopefully this will help people who are scared of water wars. And just a shout out for our group Doomsday Debunked, and where we help people who are scared of many things, and we welcome you as a fact checker, or as someone who's scared, or someone who's good at reassuring people who are in a very anxious state of mind. And do read the rules at the head of the group before you post, when you comment or post. At least have a look at the start of it and have a glance over it and get an idea of how the rules work. If you are someone who is, especially autistic people, then it's very useful to read the rules through, because then you have a very clear idea of how the group works, and then you can fit in with everyone else. So, okay, that's we are unlike most Facebook groups. We don't have vague things like be nice. We have very strict rules, very clearly set out rules, and that helps autistic people, because then it's very clear what you can and can't do. And so we are very, the moderating is by the rules. So anyway, I'll upload this and hopefully help some of you who have got scared of water wars, and hopefully, and do share it with other people who are scared as well. And hopefully you can now see that it's not something to be scared of. It's not at all a future that we're going to be. I mean, you're never going to have a world war over water. That makes no sense at all. Absolutely no sense. And not going to have a major war. You're not going to have China fighting India over water or something like that. I hope you can now see how that's totally impossible.